Well, would you turn with me, if you haven't already, to the book of Ecclesiastes? That's where we're going to be this evening. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We'll be beginning the second chapter today. Before we begin, just to do a little bit of recap here. Does anyone remember or recall why we call this book Ecclesiastes? Does anyone know where that name comes from? Anyone off the top of their head? Yeah, so Ecclesiastes comes from the Greek word ekklesia, which that word in the Greek ekklesia just means assembly or congregation, or what we get the word for church, right? And if you look at the very beginning of the book, it says that it's the words of the preacher. Now that word preacher, does anyone know remember what that was in Hebrew? In the Hebrew for the word preacher, it's yes, so that's what it means. So the Hebrew word is koheleth, and what that word means is what you said, it's one who addresses the assembly. So if you have one who is addressing the assembly in Hebrew, and then you just translate that to the Greek, it's one who is addressing the ecclesia. And so what Ecclesiastes is meaning the one who's addressing the ecclesia. So that's what Ecclesiastes means, just the preacher, basically, is what that word means. So maybe you didn't know that, or maybe you just needed some refresher. So this book, it's called Ecclesiastes, and it's because it's the words of the preacher. And who most likely is the preacher in this book? King Solomon, right? As we see in the beginning, it says that he's the son of David and the king in Jerusalem. And though there are some potential other views on who this may be, most likely it's Solomon, and that's been the traditional view. And what the book of Ecclesiastes is it's part of the Bible's wisdom literature, right? So there are different categories of the books of the Bible. There's historical books like Esther, Acts, there's the Gospels, there's the Psalms, there's the prophets. Well, there's also certain books that are part of the wisdom literature, and that would include Job, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And so what we're seeing then in this book is it's going to be a message that's trying to teach us how to live out practical wisdom, how we actually can live a wise and well life. And so that's kind of the overall theme or view of the book. And if this is Solomon, as we've said, then it's probably written in the later parts of his life, which means after living a prodigal life, which if you know Solomon, he did a lot of sinful living for a long period of his life. This would be actually a good sign of his repentance at the end, where he's actually learned a lot from his mistakes. And so what this book could be viewed as then is a way for him to teach us how to not live out his mistakes. Like we are to learn from his mistakes so we don't have to follow in the same track. And so that's kind of the purpose of the book. And so what he seeks out to do here in this book is he's seeking out the meaning and purpose of life. He says, how can I find meaning in this life? Or what is the purpose of my existence? How can I be truly fulfilled and satisfied? And so that's what he's seeking out to do in this book. And at the very beginning of verse 2, what we find is a rather depressing conclusion that he makes, and really is going to be the whole theme, or the major theme throughout the book, where he basically says that as he's looked to the meaning of life, and as he's looked for everything that is under the sun, he says that it's all vanity, right? Does anyone remember what that word in Hebrew is? Vanity, it's all hevel. Hevel. Which literally that means, sometimes it can be translated as vanity or meaningless, but really what hevel means is it literally just means smoke or vapor or breath, right? So some examples I've used before, it's like if you were outside on a cold night and you breathe and you see your air just for a second and then it starts to just dissipate really quickly. Or if you blow out a candle and you see the smoke there and you try to grab it, and though it was really there and you could smell it and see it, it disappears immediately as you try to grab onto it. Or if you see a bubble, right, and you see it, it's floating, and as soon as you touch it, it's gone. And he says that's what life is like. He says it's all vapor, it's smoke, and it's like chasing or grasping after the wind. And in fact, you'll see him say that today, as well as we've already heard him say it a few other times, that it's like chasing after the wind or trying to hold on to the wind. You just can't do it. It's futile to try to seek that. And he says so often, or so too, is trying to find meaning or fulfillment in these things under the sun. Yes? Yes, yeah, so futility would be emptiness. It would be absurd to try to, like I said, trying to grasp at the wind, right? You can't actually do it. So that's a good example. And so what we saw him do then at the end of chapter 1 is he actually begins to burst these bubbles for us. So he doesn't just say it in just a general sense. At the beginning of chapter 1, he's like, all right, basically everything is vanity. Everything is hevel, right? But then he gets really specific now. He's like, let me prove it to you. And so what he did last time is he looked at wisdom, right? Which most of us would have thought, well, surely if you pursue wisdom, and if you have wisdom and all of the knowledge of the earth, then you're going to find the meaning of life, and you're going to be happy and fulfilled, right? Well, if you look at the end of chapter 1, it actually says the exact opposite, right? After Solomon, who was uniquely gifted with wisdom, right? Because we know that he asked God for wisdom, and God gave him more wisdom than any other human being that's ever had wisdom. And in verse 18, what does he say? What is the conclusion of his pursuit of wisdom? It says, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So he says, the more that I gained in knowledge and wisdom, the more sorrow and vexation and grief that I gained, because as you learn more things, you become more uncertain about other things. And after you answer one question, it makes you think about 3 other questions. And there's all these other potential reasons for why he felt empty or it being futile to trying to find ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction in his pursuit of wisdom, right? And it's like, I use another analogy, it's like getting a pail and trying to draw out water from the ocean. And though you could get a pail and fill it up, as soon as you look back at the ocean, it's all still there. And so it's like you're trying to draw from the waters of wisdom, and you're never going to get it all. And even if you get it in your bucket, you're not going to keep it, because usually we forget information, right? We lose the knowledge that we've gained over time. We can't recall everything. So he showed us a clear example of how wisdom can't get us the meaning of life or true satisfaction or fulfillment. Well, now in chapter 2, he's going to burst another bubble for us. And that bubble is the pursuit of pleasure. So now Solomon, he's going to move away from just seeking after wisdom, and now he's going to pursue pleasure, the things of the earth, right? Maybe he can find enjoyment and pleasure in life, and maybe that will be the meaning. So let us read chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. It said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So now he bursts the bubble of pleasure for us in this beginning of chapter 2. And so what we see here is, like in the previous chapter, he begins another pursuit, right? Another quest. And what he does is he says he's going to test. Or another way to think of it is he's going to produce an experiment. It's like he's actually going to go, and he's actually like testing and experimenting with these things to kind of see objectively, does this give me meaning? Does this give me true fulfillment, satisfaction that will last, right? Ultimate purpose. He's actually wanting to look at this from an objective perspective. And so he's going to experiment with mirth, or with pleasure is basically what he's talking about. So that's what he wants to do now. He wants to test all of these different types of pleasure, and then he wants to look at them objectively and see, does this give me what I'm looking for? And it's interesting because in verse 3, as well as in verse 9, he says something specific, and he's saying, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my heart with wisdom. Now in verse 9, he once again says, and he did not allow his wisdom to leave him. And I think what it's telling us here is that Solomon didn't just become an alcoholic. He didn't just become an addict. He didn't just start pursuing pleasures to the point where he was just completely out of it, not thinking anymore. No, what he was doing is he was actually doing it through the lens of objectivity. He was actually doing it tactfully and somewhat in moderation so that he could actually be testing and sampling these things. So don't think of him as saying, oh, I just gave in to pleasure and I just got drunk and I did all the drugs I possibly could and I was out of my mind, right? And I lost my house, I lost my everything. No, because we see clearly he's actually effective in being able to build houses, build gardens. So he's not someone that just like completely just goes crazy. He keeps his wisdom, but he's sampling these things. And so that's how he's going to test this. He's going to sample in moderation these different types of pleasures, and then he's going to have an assessment about them. And so what we see here then is that Solomon, he seeks out meaning in worldly pleasures and material possessions. And so I just want to kind of go through this list of the things that he sampled, right? So we have these worldly pleasures and material possessions. So in verses 2 and 3, we see that he mentions laughter, he mentions wine, and he mentions folly. Now, laughter, I'm sure many of us can relate to that. We all like to laugh, right? We probably find pleasure in laughing. I'm sure that many of us like to tell jokes or like to hear a good joke, or if we watch TV, especially if you're in, you want to be in a good mood, you want to watch a comedy maybe. Maybe you like to go to comedy clubs, or, we like to laugh, right? Some people will even say laughter, it's like, it's a good medicine for you, right? So that's one thing he chooses. And then he goes a different route with wine, and we know that a lot of people also like to turn to wine or alcohol to make themselves feel better, right? So he chooses these options, and then also he mentions folly here. Now, some think that what that means is he chose to be foolish, or he chose to give up his wisdom, but as we see already, he said that he didn't lose his wisdom. So what I saw from what most commentators will say on this is that what folly is referring to is like parties. So he was like regularly going to big group events where he could be with people and socialize, because a lot of times people think, if I'm in a bigger crowd or if I have a lot of people around me, then they will make me feel better. And typically all these things kind of go together, right? Because you go to a party so you can laugh, have fun, and drink a lot of times, right? Not always, but typically that's what you'll see in that type of setting. So that's one route that he takes. Then in verses 4 to 6, he then starts to list off all these other projects that he pursues. And so what he does is he builds houses, vineyards, gardens, orchards, trees, and pools. Now that's someone that was really busy, right? And it even says that he was doing a lot of this. Now I'm sure he had a lot of help, and I'm sure if he got tired or didn't want to do something anymore, he probably had somebody else do it. But he was participating in this, so he was actually being active. And if you notice how it's plural in all of these, he didn't say, I built a nice house, a nice vineyard, a nice garden, a nice orchard, a nice tree, right? These are multiple. So it's literally like, it almost looks like it's alluding to the Garden of Eden, if you can think about it, with the garden and this nice lush trees with all these fruits, right? And unlike the Garden of Eden, there's not forbidden fruit here. He can do whatever he wants in this garden, kind of a thing. So he has all of these things that he's pursuing, and I saw one quote that it's like Solomon was basically creating a world within a world. Is what he was doing. He was creating this all for himself. And in a sense, that's what I think a lot of us have tried to do at some point, or we have that somewhat of a desire in our hearts, right? We want Eden now, right? We want what we lost, right? Where we sinned and lost that perfect state where everything was good and there wasn't any problem. There was just pleasure and goodness, right? Well, I think that's kind of what Solomon was doing here. He's like building his own world, and it looks like a Garden of Eden again. So he's seeking this that I think many of us have a desire for. In the verse 7, we see that it adds some other things, and this one includes servants as well as herds and flocks. So that would be something a king would definitely boast in, right? Typically, a successful king would be someone who had a lot of servants as well as a lot of, oxen, flocks, different things, cattle, all these different things. So we see that he also has a ton of these. In verse 8, it mentions then not only that, but he has silver and gold and musicians. And what's interesting in verse 8, if you will look there, if you haven't already, it also says, after it says male and female singers, it says the delights of the sons of men, and then it says and musical instruments of all kinds. Now, if you have a different translation than mine, yours might actually, instead of saying musical instruments of all kinds, it actually might say concubines, which is interesting because if you look at that word, it actually usually means women or it could be a concubine. So it's interesting why certain translations, I honestly know why they go specifically that route with some translations. So I actually believe it's probably leaning towards concubines because as I'll read for us, we know that Solomon definitely had a lot of concubines. He definitely liked all these other things. So I just want to read for you just to give you some perspective of how much silver and gold Solomon had. Okay? In 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 14 and 15, it says, "The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of traders, from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the country." Now, think about this for a second. So what this is saying is, obviously in Ecclesiastes, it says that he's gained tons of silver and tons of gold, right? Well, in this verse, in 1 Kings, what it literally says is that annually, so that means every single year, Solomon was getting 666 talents of gold. So if you had 6,600 of gold, period, you would probably think that's a lot, right? Just to think about it that way. Well, but what it's saying is it's a talent. So what a talent is a talent of gold would be like 60,000 denarii. So a denarius would be like a day's wage, right? So now if you're thinking about it, a talent of gold is 60,000 days worth, and then he gets 666 of them annually. So that's just, if you can just calculate that, you're getting into millions and millions of dollars worth of income. Is that what he's raking in annually? And that's, like I said, that's just what he's getting regularly. That's not him conquering anybody else. That's not, that's without him doing anything else. He's just getting that money coming into him. So we see that he definitely was someone that was not only wise, was he someone that was able to have these different luxuries and building these things, but he also has all of this money that he's accruing. And then in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, here is where we see this allusion to the concubines, which if you have, like I said, I think it's the ESV, NIV, I think should all be mention concubines. So if you have one of those translations, they'll probably mention this. But it says in 1 Kings 11, 1 to 3, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, 'You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods.' Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." Now think about scale here, right? So this is him saying that he has had 700 wives and princesses, right? And then that's not enough. And then he has 300 concubines, right? So this is like as excessive as you can possibly get of having how many women you want to have, right? So I think that definitely, even if this verse in Ecclesiastes 8, or chapter 2, verse 8, isn't referring to concubines, we know definitely he did pursue this route for pleasure with having this many women at his disposal at this time. So we see in verse 8, we see the silver, the gold, musicians, and concubines. In verse 9, we see that he kind of does a little bit of a summary here of basically saying, and basically his fame and his fortune, basically everything that he's accomplished and who he is as king, it's excelled all other human beings. Basically anyone before him, he's basically above them all, right? So he basically has, the fame, he has the fortune, he has status, power, just everything you can possibly imagine. He has it all, right? And so you would think then that, that would basically cover it. But if that wasn't clear enough that he's basically pursued every route that we might think of, he then in verse 10 says this. He says, "And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure." So now what he's literally saying is, and there were certain things that he hasn't probably mentioned or thought of, and he says that basically there was no avenue of pleasure that was denied by him. Basically, if there was anything that he saw and he's like, I like that, I want that, I want it now, I get it. And that's basically what it do. So if there was anything that he thought, that might give me some pleasure, he sought it out and tried it. He sampled it, right? And so that's what he was doing. And after all of this sampling, all of this experimenting and testing, what was his conclusion? It was vanity, right? The same thing that he said before, and he'll continue to say, right? In verse 11, what he says is, "Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity," that's hevel, "and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun." So what Solomon is saying is he was disillusioned by his pursuit of pleasure, that he recognized pleasure ultimately doesn't give him any profit. Did you have a question?
I have a question. Through your study, does it give you any time period? We went through all that, you talking about that over the year, months, how long that was?
So if you notice some of the verses that I've already referenced, like 1 Kings 10, 1 Kings 11, those are where some scholars think that maybe this is alluding to where they're making these comments. But throughout most of his reign, he had a lot of these things happening. So I would just say that it's probably characterizing his reign through his life. Yeah. So after Solomon, he, as I said, he's done all of this testing. He's come to this conclusion once again that it's chasing after the wind, that there's no profit of this pursuit. We might ask ourselves, well, why did he come to that conclusion, right? Not just that he did it and said it, but why? Well, I think that as we saw with the pursuit of wisdom, there's a few things. I think that when we think about pleasure, we recognize that it ultimately does not fulfill us, and it never truly lasts. That is to say, that as we think about these pleasures, that we'll go through some of them again, we'll actually start thinking about them personally, but think about them, how they don't ultimately really fulfill us, complete us, right? Make us whole. And they never really last. And if you think about Solomon for a second, right? All of these things we've just read and mentioned about all of the things he's gained and accrued, where are they today? Think about this. Even the temple, which isn't even mentioned here, right? The temple that he was responsible for building is gone. So think about all of this stuff that the greatest, most wise, and the most well-off king, where is all of this stuff that was supposed to fulfill him and last and endure? It's gone. And I think that that's, kind of enlightening for us. And in fact, in Proverbs 14:13, we see this. It says, "Even in laughter, the heart may sorrow, and the end of mirth may be grief." That sounds a lot like what he said at the end of chapter 1 when it came to accruing wisdom. He gained wisdom. What did he gain? Grief. Now in Proverbs, it's saying you can have laughter or you can have mirth, which that word basically means joy or pleasure. And even when you have that, the end is still grief. It's still sorrow. It's still this cycle of vexation that he's been dealing with. And so let's think about this. Let's see, how does pleasure fail this test of endurance and fulfillment? Well, as it's already been mentioned in this verse I just shared in Proverbs, think about laughter, right? Have you ever laughed before? Or maybe you've been somewhere and people are laughing, and so you kind of go with the crowd and you laugh, but whenever you leave, you're really still feeling really empty. Have you ever felt that before? Or everybody else is smiling, so you put on a smile, right? And so, or they ask, how are you doing? You're like, oh, I'm doing fine, or I'm doing great. That's what, that's typically the thing, is most people say, fine. I do that even just instinctively. I'm not even trying to be, I'm not trying to lie. That's just a response that we say. But I think that so often we can laugh, we can smile, we can say we're doing fine, but ultimately we can actually be feeling empty or sorrowful or experiencing grief. So I think likewise he noticed as he was going to these parties, as he was maybe listening to the best comedians of his day, and he was hearing this, and he was thinking, wow, I mean, they were funny. Like, I laughed, but then the show was over. And for me, it's like that. Do we notice that that's what entertainment really is? We go to watch entertainment, and all of us, I'm sure, watch TV shows or movies or go to a comedy show, like I said, or whatever it is we go to seek entertainment for, and then eventually it's over, right? And we got to get back to our lives. But so often we don't like that, and so then we jump right back into some more entertainment, right? Because that's what entertainment is, escaping our lives. That's why he says laughter is madness, because what it is it's us laughing and pretending everything's great, but we're all pretending like there's not really all of this horrible stuff going on. We're not really pretending like we got to go back to work tomorrow, we got to toil some more, we're all going to die, there are people dying of cancer, suffering is rampant, right? So he's like, laughter's madness, entertainment is madness, because we pursue these things, we escape the world, but really as we laugh, we know that eventually the movie's over, the comedy's over, the laughter ceases, and we get back to the grief. So I think that's where maybe he's starting to struggle with this, as he's like, laughter's not going to do it. And he also mentions wine, right? Now, I don't need to tell many people that if you drink a lot of wine or turn to a lot of alcohol or drugs, how that ultimately doesn't lead to a lot of fulfillment, right? I think that we all probably are aware that it numbs you. You might feel good, and you might even enjoy pleasure for a moment, but then you get the hangover, right? Or you wake up and you still have the problems that you had the night before, but now you just feel a little more lethargic, right? So though that wine or alcohol, though there might be some pleasure in it, we see that ultimately even that is not going to be very fulfilling. And in fact, typically, if you're someone that really is wanting to get either high or drunk, you usually get to a certain level, right? And then eventually you don't get to that level anymore. And that's why people get addicted to like certain substances. And so what they do is they try to chase the high. And so they have to do more next time. And so it becomes this cycle, right? And so I think he's seeing here likewise, wine isn't going to do it for me. The things that people are enjoying at these parties, it's not going to do it for me. It's just not going to last. And then he thinks about the houses, the vineyards, the gardens, the orchards, the trees, the pools. Think about this. He actually says in here that he enjoyed the toil part. He actually liked the purpose of working day to day. And I think that God actually gave us work for that reason. God gave us work so that we don't go insane, I think. Because if you're just sitting around doing nothing, you don't really feel very accomplished. But he actually found some enjoyment as he was working, but eventually you have to stop. Eventually you finish the project. And then so what do you do once you finish the house, once you finish the vineyard? I mean, you go sit on it, or you go sit in it, and you're just sitting around. But then it's like, okay, now what? I mean, yeah, it's nice, but what if there's no one there to enjoy it with you? You know? I mean, people are still going to die. I'm still going to die. And whenever I die, it's still going to go away. And like I said, where are all these things? They're gone. So he's like, so once again, it's not ultimate fulfillment, it's not lasting, it's not enduring. And then you can list the same things for servants, herds, flocks, all of those things eventually pass away, and they don't last either. And I think about silver and gold. I was thinking about that this week. I was thinking about, what is silver and gold? Why is it so valuable to us? Really? I mean, we ascribe it worth, but really they're shiny rocks. Think about this. If aliens existed, they came to the earth and were like, hey, we got this and this is gold. This is worth a lot. So give us your spaceship and we'll give you this rock. An alien would look at you like, no, I don't want your earth rocks, right? So I mean, but the thing is, we ascribe so much worth to that because people will trade and sell and use it, right? But really, gold and silver it's stupid if you have everything. He already has everything. So why do you need all this millions and millions of dollars worth of gold? Like it really just, it's nonsensical at some point when you're accruing all of this wealth. And then we see that, as I've mentioned, he has these musicians, music. Once again, I'm sure many of us love certain songs, but eventually the song ends, right? And I'm sure none of us listen to the same song forever. Now, there might be certain ones that you listen more frequently on repeat, maybe, or maybe there's one that you like to listen to for a season. But I know me, like even a song I really like and maybe I've listened to 100 times, I wouldn't want to listen to that forever. Like if it was on repeat forever, that almost would be frustrating, right? And so he's saying, even the musicians, even the music doesn't really do it for me. It gives me some pleasure for a time, but it doesn't last. And then as we get to thinking about concubines, which obviously that would be the sexual pleasure, right? And I know many people turn to that. And in fact, today, we as human beings have the access through pornography and through websites and stuff like that you have your own harem of concubines if you want them, right? There are people that are regularly going to those things. And if you talk to people who are addicted to porn, they usually don't say it's a great thing. They aren't saying usually, oh, I feel so fulfilled in this, that I'm so proud of this. There's a reason most people don't talk about it. They're not proudly talking about their porn addiction, right? And actually, if they would be honest with you after they've utilized this option, right, they were trying to find pleasure or fulfillment in it, usually what they'll say is they feel gross afterwards. They feel weak or embarrassed, right? They don't feel accomplished. They don't feel fulfilled, right? They're not going to brag about it. And so I think likewise, as we think about that just in our own lives, or even if you're in your own marriage, right, even a good, healthy marriage, right? If you have that relationship, you recognize that isn't ultimately your purpose. That is not ultimate fulfillment, right? So we see that there are these different options here. In verse 9, and once again, he mentions fame and fortune, right? How many of us know people that were super famous and then they killed themselves? They intentionally OD'd, right? Or even jumping back to laughter, there's so many comedians that literally they're supposed to be the funny ones. They're supposed to be the happy ones, and they are committing suicide. The thing is, it doesn't matter how rich or how famous or successful you are, you're going to be feeling that none of these things really satisfy. And in fact, there's a quote by Tom Brady, who's arguably the best quarterback of all time. You can maybe debate it, right? But clearly a very successful quarterback nonetheless, right? And there's an interview that he has after winning multiple Super Bowls, and they're having an interview with him, and they're asking him like what he thinks about it. And he makes a very, I think, telling statement where I think many of us feel this and recognize this. He's like, there has to be something more. Think about this. This is a guy who has a supermodel wife at the time, has won, championship after championship, has all the money he could possibly want. He's healthy and physical shape. He's like a Solomon of our day, right? Everyone knows his name, and he's still saying, as he's thinking about, he's already got the greatest accomplishment he can possibly get in his life, and he's like, there has to be more. And I think that's us. We recognize this, right? We recognize that pleasure does not really meet our needs. We continue this search of meaning in our lives, and these things, though many of us, we obsess over them, and I think that we need to recognize that. We still feel the temptation to do what he does. Even though we know this, I think intellectually, we still obsess and we pursue accumulating wealth and trying to maximize our pleasure. And I'm just wondering how many of us are being aware of those things. What are the things that you're being drawn to and being tempted to think, I'm going to find pleasure in this. I'm going to find true satisfaction in this. What is the lie you're telling yourself? Is it entertainment? Are you thinking that I'm going to find this in entertainment? Is it in drugs? Are you thinking, I need this? This is going to complete me. Or alcohol? Or is it in possessions? Are you taking your pride in having that house, right? Like I said, Solomon had multiple. Do you need multiple houses? Not just the biggest house in your neighborhood, but you also need the lake house. You also need the vacation house on the beach across, the country. Like, do you need all of these things to try to compare yourself to others? Is it these possessions that you're comparing? Is it money? Is it the gold rocks? Is it the pretty rocks that you're like, or the pretty paper, right? Like, is that what really you think you're going to find meaning and fulfillment in? Or is it relationships? I know especially some younger people, they think that if they just could find their spouse, right, just find the one, then they would be truly happy. And I think that we know, if you're someone that's been married, you understand that no matter how great and how much you love your spouse, that they can't be God to you. They can't truly meet all of your deepest needs that are within your soul. So I think that we even see that there. And then as I've already mentioned with sex, we know there's a reason why people keep going back after sex, right? And whenever you go for sex, we see that there can become a perversion of sex, because after you've been exposed to so much, especially through what the world has nowadays, you can become so twisted that you can't even be fulfilled anymore in what normally would have fulfilled or would have pleased you at the time. So we see that all of these things, though we buy into the lies, none of them are going to do it. And I think that it's so important that we think as well as Americans, right? Most Americans today are richer, and I know I've said this before, but we are richer than most of all of the human beings in all of history, right? You right now are richer than majority of people throughout history. If you have a smartphone, if you have a house with AC, if you have electricity, if you have a refrigerator, if you have a car, all of these things are greater than anything that all of these other people throughout history had ever seen or experienced. And the thing is, if you've noticed in our world, the more that we've gained, right, as we've continued to grow in this material prosperity, you notice that we still continue to struggle with the things that Solomon is experiencing here. With all of our material prosperity, we still suffer from the poverty of the soul. And in fact, I would say that we've actually increased. Like he says, he increases in knowledge, he increases in grief, he increases in this mirth, and he increases in grief. Think about this. In the U.S., as we are continuing to prosper compared to all of these other generations before us, why do we see people growing in antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, this mental health crisis? We're seeing all of these issues, these addictions, these struggles, these frustrations, but we should be, if these things really meet our needs and fulfill us, we should be all happy and joyous and not struggling anymore, right? But I think we clearly see in our own world, just like what Solomon was seeing, none of these things will cause you or give you what you're seeking in the meaning of life. And I think one other thing that I just want to draw on this about our appetite for pleasure. If you notice, if you keep meeting that, that desire, that appetite that you have for pleasure, if you notice, the more you keep feeding it, the more you crave, right? It's like, I've used this analogy before, it's like drinking salt water, right? You think in the immediate context, you're like, if I just had a little bit of salt water, it would quench my thirst, right? Because it's water and it looks delicious and I'm really thirsty. And you drink a little, but as you drink it, you become more thirsty rather than less thirsty. And that's the same thing with riches and with these possessions and with seeking pleasure of this world. As we keep doing it and you just get more and more thirsty, your appetite just increases and you're never truly fulfilled. And so what do we do? What is our answer then to what Solomon's teaching us here? Well, I think Psalm 119:37 gives us a helpful answer. It says, "Turn away my eyes from looking at worthless things and revive me in your way." I think that's something that we should be praying regularly. God, that you would help us keep our eyes from things that don't ultimately matter, that don't give us true meaning and fulfillment and purpose, and allow us to be revived in your way and in his will. That's what I think we need to be praying, because as you've seen me do through most of these lessons, is the point what Ecclesiastes is doing is always to turn back to God. That God is the answer to our frustration, to this futility, through this vanity that we're seeing. We see that true pleasure and satisfaction are found in God and God alone. In Psalm 16:11, it says this, "You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Think how beautiful that is. That is the hope, that is the promise that we have as believers. It literally says that in God, he gives us the path of life. And not only that, but it says in his presence is the fullness, the completion of joy. To be fulfilled in our pleasures, in our desires, in our joy, it's found in his presence. And as Christians, we actually can have his presence within us. We can have the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. And so we can literally have his presence in the fullness of joy with us. And then it says, at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So those pleasures that, they come and they go here on the earth under the sun, and God's presence and at his right hand, these pleasures that he offers us are forevermore. That means they're everlasting. They are eternal. And so what we see then is that God himself is a God of pleasure. Now, we don't always think of God like that, do we? We think God almost seems like prudish, right? We're like, God is anti-pleasure. Like, we just want to live our pleasure-seeking lives, right? But God is all about pleasure. He loves pleasure. You know, God actually created us and made us to where we like and enjoy pleasure. You realize that? He didn't make pleasure necessarily a bad thing. We corrupt it. We abuse the gifts that he has given us. But no, we were made for pleasure because we were made for God. And God is a God where the presence of joy is found, where the pleasures are unending. And in fact, I think that it's important that we think we were made by God and for God. In Romans 11:36, for of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. That is, all things are made through him, by him, and are for him, to give him glory, to enjoy him, and to glorify him. And likewise in 1 Corinthians 15:27-28, we see there's this conclusion where it says that he has put all things under him, and God, so that God may be all in all. We sang that song tonight. Is God all in all to you? Is he everything to you? Because that's who he's meant to be. He literally created you for himself, so that whenever you find him, you find true meaning. You find your purpose in life. You know, there's something I heard recently, or actually I read it recently, where it says in the creation story, you know, when God is creating all things, right? It's interesting, he addresses the water, right, before he creates and fills it with the fish. And then whenever he addresses the dry land, and then we see from the dry land, it brings out the trees. But it's interesting, he doesn't address the dry land, he doesn't address the water whenever he creates us. Instead, what he does is he addresses himself. He says, let us make man in our image, and then he creates mankind. Now, why is that important, I think? Because if you take fish out of the water, they die, right? They thrive in water, but if you take them out of their environment, they die. What happens if you take a tree out of the soil and don't replant it? The tree dies. You take it out of its environment. I think that's what God is revealing to us in his word. If you take us out of his presence, if you separate us from our true purpose, which is in seeking and finding and worshiping and glorifying him, we actually spiritually die. And then ultimately, we know we also physically die. I think that's what we're finding here, is that you find the opposite of joy and pleasure and fulfillment if you stray and depart from God, but in God you actually thrive. You find where you were meant to be all along. And that's what he did in the garden. He put us with him and fellowship with him. And that's what Christ does to gain re-fellowship, commitment and communion with him through that peace on the cross. And so what then do we think about, finally, about these things that Solomon has talked about? Do we basically say, well, that means we need to hate laughter, we need to hate wine, we need to hate money, or we need to hate or anything that possibly gives us joy, sex, relationships, marriage? Do we just get rid of it all? Well, I don't think that's what we need to do. I think we actually need to recognize that God has given us good things on the earth for our enjoyment. The issue is not that these things are good or that we should not enjoy them on the earth. It's just our perspective on them. The issue that Solomon was doing is that he was putting the cart before the horse, right? He was saying, I want to pursue these things in an end in themselves. And that's not what we're going to do. What we need to do is we need to pursue God and enjoy him, seek him in his righteousness. And then what does it say? Jesus said, and all these other things will be added unto you. So that's what we're supposed to do. It's what we do is we say, God, we want you to fulfill us. And if you can think of us like as a cup, God fills us to the very top, to the brim. God covers us completely. And then every other little thing that we're talking about here when it comes to the joys of life, the laughter, the beauty, the music, the wine, the relationship, the sex, all of these things, that's just God pouring more onto the cup, and so it's overflowing. That's literally what Christ has done for us. Christ has allowed us to gain pleasure from the world, but what it does is it just reinforces how good our God is. So the pleasure that once failed to satisfy us now helps us find an even greater joy in the goodness of God. So that's how we should think about these things. Don't try to seek them for your true satisfaction. Seek God and then enjoy the other things and just recognize, oh, God gave me this as extra. as overflow of blessings. As David says in the Psalms, right? My cup runs over, right? It overflows because God is so good. God has been so good to him and blessed him with so many things. And so that's the challenge that I have for us, is to think about where are these areas where you're being deceived, where you're seeking after these things and trying to find meaning or purpose or fulfillment or status or whatever it is in these things, and then recognize God is the answer. You were made for God. He is the answer. He's going to fulfill you. And if you haven't felt that yet, seek after him and ask God, meet that need in me. Because here's the thing, the world is never going to follow God if you're not seeing how beautiful and lovely and majestic God is. And if you haven't truly got that point yet, I don't think you've really understood who God is, who Christ is. If you recognize truly who Jesus is, how he's the author and creator of all these beautiful things, all these things that we think, no, this is so awesome, I really desire this. Remember, God is the creator of all of it. He is the source of all these goodness, all these blessings, all of these things. So as 2 Timothy 3:4, it gives us that challenge, and that's what I want to leave with us. Are we going to be lovers of pleasure, or are we going to be lovers of God? That's what 2 Timothy 3:4, it challenges us. Do you want to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, or are you going to love these pleasures that won't ultimately fulfill you and they're not going to endure?